262 men and 5 minutes. When those 5 minutes were over, 8 out of every 10 of them were dead or wounded. Those 3 numbers belonged to a single regiment, on a single hillside, on a single afternoon in July of 1863, and together they tell one of the most extraordinary and least known stories of the entire Civil War. Almost everyone has heard of Gettysburg. Almost everyone has heard of Pickett's charge, the doomed Confederate assault that came on the third and final day. But this happened the day before, and it has been quietly forgotten, overshadowed by more famous men on more famous corners of the field. And that is a genuine shame, because in some ways it is the purest and the coldest story the entire battle ever produced. Because in the end, this is not a story about glory. It is a story about arithmetic. What makes the charge of the 1st Minnesota so unforgettable is not simply that those men were brave, though they were as brave as any soldiers who ever lived. It is that their own commanding general looked at them, did the cold math in his head, and deliberately spent them. He sent 262 men to attack a force several times their size, not because he thought for one moment that they could win, but because he needed to buy a few minutes with their lives, and they were the only coins he had left to spend. This is the story of the 5 minutes that may have saved the center of the Union Army and of the terrible price the farmers of Minnesota paid to purchase them. To understand why that price had to be paid at all, you have to go back a few hours to the moment the entire center of the Union line came within a hair of falling apart. It was the 2nd day of the battle, the 2nd of July, 1863. The Union Army was drawn up along a low ridge running south of the town of Gettysburg, a position shaped a little like a fish hook, and the whole of it depended on the line staying unbroken. And on that hot afternoon, a Union general named Daniel Sickles made one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war. Without orders to do so, he marched his whole corps forward, down off the ridge and out into the low ground in front of it, to occupy what he believed was better ground around a peach orchard and a wheat field. It was a catastrophe in the making. By pushing forward, Sickles had stuck his corps out all alone, far in advance of the rest of the army, with both its flanks hanging in the air. And when the Confederate assault came crashing in, directed by James Longstreet, it struck that exposed corps like a sledgehammer. Sickles's men fought desperately, but they were outflanked and overwhelmed, and they were driven back in bloody ruin through the peach orchard and the wheat field, places that would be remembered forever after, as among the most terrible killing grounds of the whole war. And as that corps collapsed and streamed back toward the ridge, something far more dangerous than the loss of one command opened up in its wake. A gap, a hole torn straight through the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, with almost nothing left behind it to fill it. And the Confederates saw it. Surging forward toward that gap came an entire brigade of Alabama soldiers under General Cadmus Wilcox, well over 1,000 men, advancing through the drifting smoke toward the soft, undefended heart of the Union position. If they reached the crest of that ridge and broke clean through it, they could split the Army of the Potomac in two, roll up its line from the inside, and quite possibly decide the entire battle a full day before Pickett's charge was ever even ordered. In that moment, there was almost nothing at all standing between Wilcox's Alabamians and the center of the United States Army. Almost nothing, but not quite nothing. And before we meet the men who were that nothing, let me be straight with you, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel was built to tell. The history most people are handed is the same small handful of famous names repeated over and over, while the smaller stories, the ones that ought to stop you cold in your chair, get left out of the telling entirely, even when they are some of the most astonishing things that ever happened on this earth. This is one of those stories. So if you want the history that almost no one ever bothers to tell, told with the full weight it actually deserves, then stop right now and subscribe, because this is the only thing this channel does. Now, who exactly were the men standing in that gap? The regiment that happened to be nearest to that hole in the line was the 1st Minnesota, and there is something almost poetic about who they were and about how far they had traveled to end up standing on that particular patch of grass. Minnesota in 1861 was barely a state at all. It had joined the Union only 3 years before the war began, a raw and remote frontier out on the far northwestern edge of the country, a land of farms and forests and small, new, half-built towns more than 1,000 miles from the fields of Pennsylvania. And yet, when the war broke out, When the guns opened on Fort Sumter and President Lincoln called on the states for troops, Minnesota was the very first state in the entire Union to answer that call. The 1st Minnesota was, quite literally, the first regiment offered to the United States in the Civil War. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, lumbermen, store clerks, and frontiersmen, ordinary men from the very edge of the map who had volunteered out of some sense of duty they probably could not have fully put into words. And by the 2nd day at Gettysburg, 2 long years of hard war had already ground the regiment down. It had marched and fought through many of the great battles of the Eastern War, and its ranks had been steadily thinned by combat, by disease, and by the constant detaching of companies for other duties, until the men standing on Cemetery Ridge that afternoon numbered only somewhere around 260. Think about that for just a moment, because it is the heart of the whole thing. 260 tired, ordinary men, volunteers from the most distant frontier of the country, more than 1,000 miles from their own homes and their own fields, were about to be asked to hold the geographic and the literal center of the entire nation, together with nothing but their bodies and their bayonets. They were not an elite shock unit. They had not been handpicked for some special mission. They simply happened to be the closest organized body of troops to the Gap at the exact instant the Gap appeared, and at the exact instant, a general came riding hard toward them, with desperation in his eyes and a terrible decision already forming in his mind. That general was Winfield Scott Hancock, one of the finest and most respected commanders in the whole Union Army, and a man who understood, in the space of just a few seconds, precisely what he was looking at and precisely what it was going to cost him. He saw Wilcox's Alabama brigade coming on hard toward the Gap. He saw that he had no reserves anywhere within reach, no fresh division to throw into the breach, nothing whatsoever to plug that hole except the one small, exhausted regiment standing directly in front of him. And he understood the brutal arithmetic of the situation with perfect, merciless clarity. He did not need to defeat the Confederate brigade. That was simply impossible. 260 men against well over 1,000. He needed only to slow it down. He needed to force it to stop and form a line and fight even for a few short minutes, while the reinforcements he knew were rushing toward him could come up and seal the breach. A few minutes. That was all he needed to buy. And the only currency he had left to buy it with was the lives of the men of the 1st Minnesota. Hancock did not flinch from it because he could not afford to flinch. He turned to the regiment, pointed toward the advancing enemy and their battle flags, and ordered the Minnesotans to charge them. It was, and everyone present seems to have understood it plainly as such, very nearly a death sentence. Hancock himself admitted as much afterward, in almost exactly those words. He knew he was ordering those men into near certain destruction, and he said that he would have given the very same order again because the line simply had to be held and there was no other way on earth to hold it. He had weighed one small regiment against the survival of the center of the army, and he had made his choice. Now it fell to the men of Minnesota to make theirs. And here is the part that lifts this story up out of the ordinary, because the men of the 1st Minnesota did not hesitate either. There was no time to gather them and explain the larger picture. No time to tell them that they were being deliberately spent to purchase a handful of minutes. They were simply ordered to charge a force several times their own size, downhill, straight into the smoke, and they lowered their bayonets and went, without a sound of protest that anyone ever recorded. What followed lasted only a few minutes, by every account that survives, though no one in the middle of it was watching a clock. The Minnesotans drove straight down the slope into the front of Wilcox's advancing line, and the sheer shock and fury of 260 men hurling themselves at a brigade of more than 1,000 did exactly the one thing that Hancock had prayed it would do. It made the Confederates stop. It forced them to halt their advance, to shift their front, to turn and deal with this sudden, screaming little regiment that had appeared out of nowhere, instead of pressing on toward the open and undefended ridge behind it. The Minnesotans could not hold the Alabamians back for long, and they were never going to. They were being shot down where they stood, but they held just long enough. They fought and they bled, and they made the enemy pay attention to them instead of to the open door at their backs. And in those few minutes, the reinforcements arrived. The Gap was filled. The center held. When it was finally over, and the few survivors were pulled back out of the smoke, someone called the roll. By the regiment's own traditional count, of the roughly 260 men who had made that charge, only around 47 were still on their feet to answer it. The rest, something close to 82% of the entire regiment, were dead or wounded, scattered across the slope they had just bought with their own bodies. It stands as one of the highest casualty rates ever suffered by any Union regiment in a single engagement of the entire war. 5 minutes, more than 8 men in every 10. That is the arithmetic of what was asked of them on that hillside, and of what they actually paid to deliver it. And it is worth pausing for a moment on what a number like that truly means, because 82% is not an abstraction, and it is not just ink on a casualty return. A regiment in that war was not a random collection of strangers thrown together. It was raised from a small handful of towns, which meant that the men standing in its ranks were brothers and cousins and childhood neighbors, friends who had grown up together, enlisted together, and then marched 1,000 miles east to Pennsylvania together. So when 8 in every 10 of them fell on that slope in the space of 5 minutes, it was not a cold statistic that traveled back home to Minnesota. It was a whole generation of young men from the same few streets, gone in a single afternoon, and there were small frontier towns that would quietly feel the hole those 5 minutes tore in them for the rest of the century. And then, almost beyond belief, the story is not even finished. Because the very next day, the 3rd of July, the survivors of the 1st Minnesota were still there on that same ridge. The small handful of men who had walked back off that slope, after losing 8 in every 10 of their friends and brothers, did not go to the rear to rest and to grieve. They took their place back in the line. And when the most famous attack of the entire war came rolling across the open fields that afternoon, the grand Confederate assault that history remembers as Pickett's Charge, the survivors of the 1st Minnesota were among the men who stood and helped to throw it back. In the swirling chaos of that fighting, one of them tore a Confederate battle flag out of the hands of the enemy. The men who had somehow lived through the impossible on the 2nd day went straight back and did it all over again on the 3rd. So what, in the end, are we to make of the 5 minutes of the 1st Minnesota? It is tempting to reach for the easy language of glory, for the trumpets and the flags and the noble sacrifice, but that kind of language actually makes the story smaller than it truly is. The real truth of it is colder and far more powerful. These were ordinary men, farmers from the far edge of the country, who were handed a piece of brutal battlefield arithmetic by a general who had no other choice to make and who paid that price without flinching from it. They were not asked to win anything. They were asked, in plain terms, to die slowly enough to matter. And they did. The 5 minutes they bought did not win the Battle of Gettysburg by themselves, and it would be dishonest to pretend that they did. But they helped to hold the center of the army together at the very moment it was most likely to break apart, and in the long arithmetic of that war, that may have been worth more than any single victory. There is a monument to them standing on that ridge today, quiet and weathered, planted on the very ground where most of the regiment fell. And the question it leaves you with is the same hard question that the numbers themselves leave you with. What is 5 minutes actually worth? The men of the 1st Minnesota answered that question with their bodies, and the answer they gave still has the power to stop you cold, more than a century and a half later, if you only know enough to go looking for them. Almost no one ever does. Now you are not almost no one.